undoubted joy at seeing Russian troops kind of, pack up their flags and head back to Moscow. I think there were even suggestions that the Ukrainian special forces might have been involved in helping some of the Syrian rebels. So they've done similar stuff in Africa. So they're well known for doing a bit of kind of muckraking and causing the Russians trouble abroad as well as here. So yeah, I think there's a kind of vicarious thrill in seeing these Syrian rebels overrun Damascus and take out one of Russia's key allies in the Middle East. Well, Russia's probably Russia's single biggest ally in the Middle East, arguably.
Yeah, and it is interesting because we've got this backdrop of potential peace talks in the new year, and Donald Trump, of course, returning to the White House. And it's interesting because at the moment it appears as if Zelensky is more prepared to get around the negotiating table than Vladimir Putin is. And I wonder how people in Ukraine are feeling about the return of Donald Trump, George, because my sense was, maybe 6 months ago, there was genuine concern about what a second Trump presidency may mean. And those concerns haven't entirely gone away. But potentially there is less pessimism than there once was about what it may mean for Ukraine. Is that your sense, speaking to people in Ukraine?
I think they can take hope from the fact that he is an unpredictable politician. And I spoke to Dmytro Kuleba, who was Ukraine's foreign minister until September. And he was stressing, Trump does what suits him in the here and now. And the political situation in the US means that he has to satisfy the electorate's concerns that American taxpayers' money is not being kind of sent down the drain in Ukraine. And so he is kind of talking a tough line on that. But suddenly, if he does cut off aid and it all goes south for Ukraine next year and the front lines collapse and the Russians are advancing, maybe they're threatening Zaporizhia, maybe they're even threatening, further into Ukraine. Trump does not want a Kabul-style capitulation. That was one of those moments where he really went for Biden. He doesn't like losers, as he frequently puts it. And if America sees Ukraine fundamentally threatened, in Kuleba's view, the domestic opinion could well shift in America, and Trump may be forced to act at that point. So just because now he's saying we're going to cut off aid, that doesn't necessarily mean that a change in what happens here forces him to reassess.
And also, I think we consistently underestimate just how effective a politician Volodymyr Zelensky is when it comes to, charming other world leaders and making the case for Ukraine. I mean, not only is he going on a lot of US podcasts at the moment, but he also, of course, is on charm offensive with Donald Trump, and we saw them at Notre Dame, for instance. Meanwhile, you have Vladimir Putin sanctioning the use of naked footage of Melania Trump on Kremlin TV around the election. Very different approaches to dealing with Donald Trump. And Trump, I sense, is sensitive to the accusation that he is some kind of poodle for Putin.
Yeah, but bear in mind as well, just as a counter narrative, that Putin sent a pretty warm message after the election welcoming Trump into place. And then if you look at what Viktor Orban has been saying, and Orban is a kind of friendly with both sides, he's trying to broker this kind of Christmas truce, a la kind of First World War style, meet in the middle of no man's land and play a game of football. Now that's been batted away by Zelensky pretty comprehensively, but Trump's team has kind of suggested that that's not a terrible idea. Perhaps Orban is kind of expressing a view from Moscow as well. So it's and I think the Hungarian role is important, given that Orban has travelled quite a lot to Mar-a-Lago. I think he went twice before the election, made it very clear who he wanted to be president. He's also gone to see Putin. And you have to say there is a reason why Hungary is doing all this, which is that Hungary is still buying quite a lot of Russian gas, and that Russian gas transits Ukraine. So throughout the war, Russian gas, there's a pipeline which actually begins in Sudzha, which is the town that the Ukrainians have taken on the Russian side, and it crosses the entirety of Ukraine. And this pipeline has continued to carry gas to countries like Austria and Hungary and give them cheap gas. And actually, Ukraine is about to, once this agreement ends on the 1st of January, Ukraine has said it's not going to renew it. So Orban is under direct threat from the war continuing next year and Ukraine threatening to turn off the taps, which they control basically, because it means that suddenly his voters are going to have a much more expensive time of heating their home and all the rest of it. So there's a reason why he's keen to act as an intermediary, but he does have the ear of Trump and he does have the ear of Putin. So he's an influential character in these talks.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you raised there. Just on your interview you mentioned with Dmytro Kuleba, the former Ukrainian foreign minister, what else did he say about Western support for Ukraine at the moment?
Well, he was very interesting. I mean, one of the last acts that he was involved in as foreign minister was over the question of using Western missiles to hit Russian territory. And that was obviously about Storm Shadows, British, Anglo-French missiles, and also ATACMS, which are these American ballistic missiles. And he was very interesting. I mean, he said the first kind of unpleasant was the word he used, conversation he had with his British counterparts was over Storm Shadows and where they were allowed to be used, because he felt that the new Labour government was not leading the world on this decision. Now, if you reflect back to previous moments when Russia said, if you do this, we will annihilate Europe with our nuclear weapons, or if you do that, then we're going to send a nuclear tsunami over Britain, all these sorts of threats. They have come, for example, when the West was debating whether or not to send tanks to Ukraine, whether or not to give long-range missiles to Ukraine. And Britain was the country that did all these things first. Now, what it didn't do was supply volume. If you look at the total amount of goods given, the US and Germany has given far more. But just by giving 14 Challenger 2s, which is a pretty small amount and is not going to tilt the balance on the battlefield, diplomatically, it had an outsized effect because it essentially embarrassed the US and Germany into taking action too, because it proved to them that Russia was just making stuff up about how this was going to trigger a huge reaction. So the Ukrainians have treasured their relationship with Britain, specifically because Britain has a large appetite for risk and will take decisions ahead of Germany and the US that then unlock a kind of wider agreement on where the kind of where the threshold of escalation lies. But in the first decision that the Labour government was faced with, they basically backed away from something that was controversial, and they said, no, we're not going to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadows to strike Russia until we get American approval. So it was the opposite to what had happened before, which is that Britain leads the way and the Americans follow in greater numbers and very effectively. At this point, it was Britain saying, we'll wait until the US does it and then we'll follow wherever they go. And for Kuleba, that is a key plank in Ukrainian diplomacy being removed if Britain is unwilling under this new government to take a risk. Now, I think it's probably related to the domestic politics in Britain of what happens to defence spending in the UK. And that is, that's a tricky one for politicians across Europe. And again, Kuleba was making the point that, all politicians in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in the kind of major capitals of defence in Europe have been reading for 2.5 years pretty apocalyptic intelligence briefings and warnings from their military commanders about the real possibility of, further aggression from Russia and the need to spend more on defence. But they are overall, seemingly, given that there's been no massive rise in defence spending in Western Europe, I'm discounting Poland, for example, and the Baltic states, which have done a huge amount to kind of rearm. But there is a reluctance to confront the electorate, to tell the electorate, maybe you are going to have to spend more on taxes. Maybe we are going to have to prioritise money away from the NHS in Britain or other huge public services and spend more on defence. And to be fair to the Labour government, they've inherited a serious. They've inherited this decision, which was basically kicked into long grass by the Conservatives. But I think that support for Ukraine is tied to that, because you're going to be less willing to take a risk if you're not sure that you're going to be able to kind of spend enough on defence to keep your deterrence at a high level.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.